I never thought that a single door could change my life forever. But here I am years later, still haunted by what I discovered behind that innocuous wooden barrier in my old middle school. My name is Michael, and this is my story, a tale of curiosity, terror, and the realization that some secrets are better left uncovered. It was just another ordinary day at Westbrook Middle School. The hallways buzzed with the usual chatter of students rushing to their next classes, lockers slamming shut, and teachers calling for order. I was in my final year, counting down the days until I could leave this place behind and move on to high school. Little did I know that the most significant event of my middle school years was yet to unfold. As I walked down the East Wing corridor, my eyes fell upon that door, the one that had always been locked. It stood at the end of the hallway, tucked away in a corner that most students barely noticed. But I had always been drawn to it, fascinated by its constant state of closure and the air of mystery that surrounded it. The door itself was unremarkable. A standard wooden door painted a dull shade of beige, matching the bland color scheme of the school's interior. What set it apart was the heavy-duty padlock that always adorned its handle, and the small, weathered sign that read, "Authorized personnel only," in faded black letters. Over the years, I had heard countless rumors about what lay beyond that door. Some said it was an old fallout shelter from the Cold War era, forgotten by time but still stocked with decades-old supplies. Others whispered about a secret laboratory where the science department conducted questionable experiments. The more imaginative students even suggested it was a portal to another dimension. My best friend Alex had his own theory. "I bet it's just a boring old storage room," he would say whenever the topic came up. "The school probably keeps it locked to stop kids from messing around with cleaning supplies or something." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Every time I passed that door, a chill would run down my spine, as if some unseen force was reaching out to me from the other side. It was a sensation I couldn't explain, a mix of fear and excitement that would disappear as quickly as it came. For 3 years, that door remained a constant source of intrigue in my daily school life. I would often find myself taking the long way to class just to walk past it, hoping that one day I might catch a glimpse of what lay beyond. But it always remained stubbornly closed, its secrets locked away behind that impenetrable barrier. Until that fateful day in late May, just weeks before the end of the school year. The final bell had rung, signaling the end of another monotonous day of classes. I was in no rush to get home. My mom worked late shifts at the hospital, so she wouldn't be expecting me for hours. As I leisurely made my way down the emptying hallways, my feet carried me almost unconsciously towards that familiar corner. As I approached the door, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. My steps slowed as I neared, my eyes fixed on the weathered wood. And then I saw it, a sliver of darkness where there should have been none. The door was ajar. My heart began to race as I glanced around the deserted hallway. There was no sign of any teachers or custodians. For the first time in 3 years, the opportunity to unravel this mystery was right in front of me. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering inches from the door. A voice in the back of my mind urged caution, reminding me of the potential consequences of being caught in a restricted area. But curiosity won out, as it so often does in the minds of 13-year-olds. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open just wide enough to slip inside, then carefully closed it behind me. The darkness that enveloped me was absolute, like a thick blanket draped over my senses. The air was cool and damp, carrying a musty scent that spoke of long-forgotten spaces. Fumbling in my pocket, I pulled out my phone and activated its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that both thrilled and unnerved me. A narrow staircase descending into the depths below the school. The stairs were made of rough-hewn stone, their edges worn smooth by the passage of time. The walls were lined with the same medieval-looking stonework, creating an atmosphere that felt completely at odds with the modern school building above. As I stood there, bathed in the pale light of my phone, I was faced with a choice. I could turn back now, close the door, and pretend I had never seen what lay beyond. Or I could take those first steps down into the unknown, possibly uncovering the truth behind years of speculation and rumor. The sensible part of me knew I should leave, but the allure of the unknown was too strong to resist. With one last glance back at the closed door, I began my descent into the darkness below, unaware that each step was taking me further away from the world I knew and closer to horrors beyond my imagination. The stone steps were cold beneath my feet, and I could feel the temperature dropping with each step I took. The beam of my phone's flashlight danced across the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move and writhe in the corners of my vision. The air grew thicker, filled with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify, but that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I descended deeper into the earth, the sounds of the school above faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the echo of my footsteps and the sound of my increasingly rapid breathing. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this subterranean passage. Had I been walking for minutes or hours? The monotony of the staircase made it impossible to tell. Just as I was beginning to wonder if the stairs would ever end, I heard a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. It was a dull, reverberating bang, like a heavy door slamming shut somewhere far above me. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized the implication. Someone or something had closed the door at the top of the stairs. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm me. Should I turn back? Try to find my way out before I became hopelessly lost in this underground labyrinth? But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, another part of me urged me forward. I had come too far to turn back now. With trembling legs, I forced myself to continue my descent. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the earth like some ancient pathway to the underworld. My phone's battery was draining rapidly, the flashlight taxing its resources. I knew I had to hurry if I wanted to have enough power to light my way back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my foot touched level ground. I had reached the bottom of the staircase. Sweeping my phone's light around, I found myself in a long, narrow tunnel. The walls were lined with unlit torches, their iron brackets rusted with age. At the far end of the tunnel, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, stood another door, this one made of heavy, dark wood reinforced with iron bands. My curiosity, momentarily dampened by the long descent, flared anew at the sight of this imposing barrier. What secrets could it be guarding? What lay beyond its weathered surface? As I started to move down the tunnel, my light caught something in the corner. A switch. An electric light switch, incongruously modern amidst the medieval stonework. With my phone's battery now dangerously low, I didn't hesitate. I flipped the switch, holding my breath as I waited to see what would happen. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, with a series of pops and crackles, the torches along the walls burst into life. Flames danced in their iron cradles, bathing the tunnel in a warm, flickering light that was somehow more unsettling than the darkness had been. With the tunnel now illuminated, I turned off my phone's flashlight to conserve what little battery remained. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows along the stone walls, creating an atmosphere that felt both ancient and ominous. Each step I took towards the door at the end of the tunnel echoed loudly, making me acutely aware of how alone I was in this strange underground place. As I neared the door, I noticed strange symbols carved into its surface, arcane markings that looked like no language I had ever seen. They seemed to shimmer and move in the torchlight, as if alive with some inner energy. A sense of foreboding washed over me, stronger than anything I had felt before. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee this place and never return. But I had come too far to give up now. With a trembling hand, I reached out and grasped the iron handle of the door. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shock through my system. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay beyond, and slowly began to pull the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound echoing down the tunnel behind me. As the door swung open, I was hit by a blast of cold air that carried with it a scent I couldn't identify, something ancient and alien that made my stomach churn. Peering into the darkness beyond, I could make out only vague shapes. The room appeared to be vast, far larger than I had expected. In the center stood what looked like a stone pedestal, and on the floor around it, I could just barely discern strange markings that seemed to glow with a faint reddish light. Suddenly I heard footsteps echoing from somewhere in the darkness. Panic seized me, and I quickly slipped inside the room, pulling the door almost shut behind me. I frantically looked around for a place to hide, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. Off to one side, I spotted what looked like a cluster of large, oddly shaped statues. Without thinking, I darted behind them, pressing myself against the cold stone as I tried to quiet my ragged breathing. From my hiding spot, I watched as two robed figures entered the room. One was dragging something large and black, a garbage bag, I realized with growing horror. The other carried a massive, ancient-looking book. They moved with purpose, seemingly unaware of my presence. The figure with the book approached the pedestal I had noticed earlier, placing the tome upon it with reverence. "You got the table yet?" they called out, their voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Almost," replied the other figure, who had disappeared into the shadows on the far side of the room. As my eyes continued to adjust to the darkness, I noticed more details of my surroundings. The floor was covered in intricate patterns and symbols, similar to those I had seen on the door but far more complex. They seemed to pulse with a faint reddish glow that made my skin crawl. My attention was drawn back to the black garbage bag the first figure had been dragging. To my horror, I noticed a pale hand protruding from one end. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. Was that a body? Fear, unlike anything I had ever known, gripped me. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape this nightmarish place and the horrors it contained. But how? The robed figures were between me and the only exit I knew of. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I decided to make a break for it. I waited until the figure by the pedestal seemed distracted, then began to inch my way along the wall towards the door. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they would hear it, but the figure seemed oblivious to my presence. I was mere feet from the door when a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze, terror paralyzing me as I heard a raspy voice behind me. "So there was someone in here after all?" "I guess so," replied the other figure, their tone unnervingly calm. I struggled against the iron grip on my shoulder, panic giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. "What are you going to do to me?" I cried out, my voice cracking with fear. The figure by the pedestal spoke, their voice dripping with malice. "It's not us you need to worry about. It's them." Before I could process what that meant, the room was suddenly flooded with light. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness, I saw something that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Standing before me were two creatures unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. They towered over me, easily 7 feet tall, their bodies pale and emaciated. But it was their faces that struck true terror into my heart. They had no eyes, no ears, just smooth, featureless skin, where those features should have been. The only things marring their blank visages were crooked, misshapen noses and mouths stretched into impossibly wide, malicious grins. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, trapped by a paralyzing fear as the creatures began to approach me with slow, deliberate steps. As they drew nearer, I realized with dawning horror that the statue I had been hiding behind wasn't a statue at all. It was another of these monstrous beings, standing perfectly still until now. One of the creatures reached out towards me. its long, spindly fingers inches from my face. In that moment, survival instinct finally overcame my paralysis. With a burst of adrenaline, I wrenched myself free from the robed figure's grasp and bolted for the door. I yanked it open and ran down the torch-lit tunnel faster than I had ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear the pounding of feet and an inhuman screech that made my blood run cold. I reached the stairs and began to climb, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning as I pushed myself beyond my limits. The sounds of pursuit grew closer as I neared the top of the staircase. Just as I thought my legs would give out, I saw the door, my gateway back to the normal world. But to my horror, it was closed. I slammed into the door, pounding on it with all my might. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was likely no one left in the school to hear me. "Please, somebody help me!" The creatures were almost upon me now. I could feel their cold presence at my back, hear their ragged breathing. In desperation, I threw myself against the door one last time. Miraculously, it swung open. I tumbled through, scrambling to my feet and slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, all was silent. Then came a series of heavy thuds from the other side, as if massive bodies were hurling themselves against the wood. I backed away, my whole body shaking. The thuds continued for what felt like an eternity, but gradually grew weaker until they stopped altogether. Still, I didn't dare move, afraid that opening the door again would unleash those horrors into the world above. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of my surroundings once more. The hallway was empty and silent, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the windows. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole terrifying experience. But the terror was still too fresh, too real. My clothes were damp with sweat, my muscles ached from the frantic climb, and I could still smell the musty alien scent of that underground chamber clinging to my skin. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the closed door, before I finally found the strength to move. On shaking legs, I made my way out of the school and into the warm spring afternoon. The normalcy of the outside world, birds singing, cars passing by, people going about their daily lives, felt surreal after what I had just experienced. That night, I tossed and turned in my bed, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyeless faces, those impossibly wide grins. I heard the inhuman screeches echoing in my mind, and I wondered, what were those creatures? What was the purpose of that hidden chamber beneath the school? And most terrifyingly, what would happen now that I had seen what was never meant to be seen? As I lay awake in the false safety of my bedroom, I couldn't have imagined how deeply my life would be changed by what lay behind that door, the door that should have stayed closed. The days following my terrifying experience in the underground chamber passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. I went through the motions of my daily life, attending classes, eating meals, engaging in conversations, but my mind was constantly elsewhere, replaying the horrors I had witnessed. Every shadow seemed to hold the potential for danger. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I found myself avoiding the east wing of the school entirely, taking circuitous routes to my classes just to stay as far away from that door as possible. My friends noticed the change in my behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. Who would believe such an outlandish tale? About a week after the incident, I began to notice something unsettling. People were disappearing. It started with Mr. Jenkins, the elderly janitor who had worked at the school for decades. One day he simply didn't show up for work, and nobody seemed to know why. Then it was Sarah, a quiet girl from my math class. Her absence was noted, but most assumed she had just moved away without telling anyone. But as the disappearances continued, a teacher here, a student there, a sense of unease began to permeate the school. Whispers and rumors spread through the hallways. Some said there was a serial killer on the loose. Others speculated about a secret government program abducting people for experiments. Only I knew the terrifying truth, but I was too scared to speak up. My guilt grew with each passing day. Could I have prevented these disappearances if I had told someone about what I had seen? But who would believe me? And even if they did, what could be done against those otherworldly creatures? It was 2 weeks after my encounter when the police finally became involved. They came to the school, asking questions and searching the premises. I watched with a mix of hope and dread as they approached that fateful door in the East Wing. Would they discover the horrors that lay beneath? Would they be able to stop whatever was happening? I held my breath as one of the officers produced a set of keys and unlocked the padlock. The door swung open and I braced myself for nothing. The officers peered inside, shone their flashlights around, and then moved on. From where I stood, I could see that the room beyond the door was nothing more than a small storage closet, filled with cleaning supplies and old textbooks. My mind reeled. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I going crazy? But no, the disappearances were real. Something was happening, even if I couldn't explain it. That night, as I lay in bed trying to make sense of everything, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft scratching at my bedroom window. I froze, my eyes wide in the darkness, as the scratching grew more insistent. Slowly, I turned my head towards the window, and what I saw nearly stopped my heart. There, peering in through the glass, was one of the creatures from the underground chamber. Its eyeless face was pressed against the window. That horrifying grin stretched impossibly wide. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The creature's mouth opened, and a voice that sounded like grinding stones whispered, "We found you, child." I must have passed out from sheer terror, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The creature was gone, and there was no sign that it had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. They had found me, just as I had feared they would. From that night on, I slept with a knife under my pillow. It wasn't much of a defense against the horrors I had seen, but it gave me a small sense of security. Every night I would lie awake, my hand clutching the knife's handle, waiting for the creatures to return. And return they did. Night after night, I would see them, sometimes at the window, sometimes hunched over my bed, always with those terrible grins. Sometimes they would speak, their voices like nails on a chalkboard, promising that they would take me soon. Other times they would simply watch, their blank faces somehow radiating malevolence. During the day, I was a wreck. My grades plummeted as I struggled to stay awake in class. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and I lost weight as my appetite disappeared. My parents and teachers were concerned, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Who would believe that monsters were visiting me each night? As weeks turned into months, the disappearances at school continued. The police were baffled, and a cloud of fear hung over the entire town. I knew I should say something, tell someone what I knew, but the fear of those creatures kept me silent. It was nearly a year after my initial encounter when things came to a head. I was walking home from school, my mind preoccupied with the terrors that awaited me that night, when I noticed someone following me. At first I thought it was just paranoia, but as I took random turns and doubled back, the figure in the hooded sweatshirt remained constant. My heart racing, I broke into a run. The figure behind me sped up as well. I darted down alleys and side streets, trying to lose my pursuer, but they seemed to anticipate my every move. Just as I thought I was about to be caught, a hand reached out from a darkened doorway and pulled me inside. I found myself face to face with Mr. Jenkins, the janitor who had disappeared all those months ago. But he looked different now, older, haggard, with a wild look in his eyes. "They're coming for you, kid," he whispered urgently, "just like they came for the rest of us." But you're special. You saw them and got away. That's why they want you so badly." What are they?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "I don't know. Nobody knows. They've been here for, well, longer than anyone can remember, living under the school, taking people when they need to. But you've seen them, really seen them, and that makes you dangerous to them." He pressed something into my hand, a small, strange-looking amulet. "This will help protect you, but it won't last forever. You need to find a way to stop them, to close the gateway they use. It's up to you now." Before I could ask any more questions, he pushed me back out onto the street. "Run, kid, and whatever you do, don't let them catch you." As I stumbled away, my mind reeling from this new information, I heard a terrifying screech behind me. Glancing back, I saw the hooded figure that had been chasing me locked in combat with Mr. Jenkins. But as the hood fell back, I caught a glimpse of a pale, eyeless face. I ran harder than I ever had before, clutching the amulet tightly. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that my life had changed forever. The horrors behind that door had become my reality, and somehow I had to find a way to end this nightmare, not just for me, but for everyone who had been taken, and for those who might be taken in the future. As I ran through the darkening streets, the weight of this responsibility settled on my shoulders. I was just a kid, in way over my head, facing monsters beyond imagination. But I was also the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could potentially stop this. With the amulet clutched in my hand, and the memory of those eyeless faces burned into my mind, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to close that gateway, to end the reign of terror these creatures had over my town. No matter what it took, no matter how long it might take, I would find a way to ensure that the door that should have stayed closed would be sealed forever. The amulet Mr. Jenkins had given me became my most prized possession. I wore it constantly, hidden beneath my clothes, and for the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. The creatures still appeared at my window, but they seemed unable to enter my room. Their frustration was palpable, their eyeless faces contorting with rage as they scratched futilely at the glass. But I knew this reprieve was temporary. Mr. Jenkins had warned me that the amulet's protection wouldn't last forever, and I could feel its power waning with each passing day. I needed to find answers, and fast. My search began in the school library. I spent every free moment poring over books on local history, mythology, and the occult. Most of what I found was useless, fairy tales and urban legends that bore no resemblance to the horrors I had witnessed. But occasionally I would stumble upon a nugget of information that seemed relevant. I learned that the land our school was built on had a dark history. Centuries ago, it had been the site of a Native American burial ground. When European settlers arrived, they desecrated the sacred site, and legend spoke of a curse placed on the land as a result. Could this be connected to the creatures beneath the school? As I dug deeper, I discovered whispers of a secret society that had existed in our town since its founding. They were said to be guardians of ancient knowledge, protectors against dark forces that threatened to invade our world. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this society must know something about the creatures. But how could I find them? They had remained hidden for centuries, and I was just a middle school student with limited resources. It seemed an impossible task, but I couldn't give up. The weight of the disappearances hung heavy on my conscience, and I knew that only by solving this mystery could I hope to save those who had been taken. Weeks passed as I continued my research, always aware of the amulet's fading power. The creature's nightly visits became more aggressive, their frustration turning to a terrifying determination. I knew my time was running out. It was on a rainy Saturday afternoon, as I sat in the public library surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and local history books, that I finally caught a break. In a dusty tome detailing the town's founding families, I found a series of names that appeared generation after generation, always connected to positions of influence in the community. Could these be the members of the secret society? Excited by this lead, I began to cross-reference these names with current residents of the town. To my surprise, I recognized several of them, including my own history teacher, Miss Abernathy. The next school day I lingered after class, my heart pounding as I approached Miss Abernathy's desk. She looked up at me with a quizzical expression. "Is everything all right, Michael?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "You've seemed distracted lately." I took a deep breath, fingering the amulet beneath my shirt for courage. "Miss Abernathy, I need to talk to you about something important, something secret." Her expression changed subtly, a flicker of something, recognition, fear, passing across her face. "I'm not sure I understand," she said cautiously. "I know about the society," I blurted out. "The guardians. I know about the creatures beneath the school. Please, I need your help." For a long moment, Miss Abernathy just stared at me, her face unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, she stood and walked to the classroom door, locking it. "How much do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her everything. My discovery of the hidden chamber, the terrifying creatures, the disappearances, and my encounter with Mr. Jenkins. As I spoke, Miss Abernathy's face grew increasingly pale. When I finished, she sank heavily into her chair. "We feared this day would come," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "The seal is weakening." "Seal?" I asked, leaning forward eagerly. "What seal?" Miss Abernathy looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "The creatures you saw, they're not from our world. Centuries ago, they found a way to break through the barriers between dimensions. The society, my ancestors and others, managed to seal the gateway, trapping the creatures in a pocket dimension beneath what is now the school. But the seal requires sacrifices to maintain its strength." I felt sick as I realized the implications. "The disappearances," she nodded grimly. "We've tried to find alternatives, but nothing else works. It's a terrible burden, one we've carried for generations. But now, the seal is failing faster than we can maintain it. If it breaks completely, the creatures will be free," I finished, a chill running down my spine. "Exactly," Miss Abernathy confirmed. "And your encounter with them, your escape, it's accelerated the process. They're desperate to recapture you, to use your energy to reinforce the seal. But if they do, they'll be strong enough to break free anyway," I realized. Miss Abernathy nodded. "You're in terrible danger, Mikey. The amulet Mr. Jenkins gave you won't protect you for much longer. We need to act fast if we're going to prevent a catastrophe." "What can we do?" I asked, both terrified and oddly excited to finally be taking action. "There might be a way to strengthen the seal permanently, without the need for sacrifices," Miss Abernathy said hesitantly. "But it's incredibly dangerous, and it would require someone who has seen the creatures, who has a connection to their world." "Me," I said, understanding dawning. She nodded solemnly. "You don't have to do this. We can try to find another way, to protect you." "No," I interrupted, surprising myself with my determination. "I have to do this. For everyone who's disappeared, for everyone who might be taken if we don't stop this. I'll do whatever it takes." Miss Abernathy looked at me with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You're very brave, Michael. Braver than many adults I know. All right, if you're sure. Meet me tonight at midnight in the school parking lot. Bring the amulet and anything else you think might help. And Michael, yes? Be careful. The creatures will be doing everything they can to stop us." As I left the classroom, my mind was reeling with everything I had learned. The weight of responsibility on my shoulders felt heavier than ever. But for the first time in months, I also felt a glimmer of hope. We had a plan, a way to potentially end this nightmare once and for all. But as I stepped out into the afternoon sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Somewhere in the shadows I knew the creatures were waiting, and tonight, one way or another, we would face them. The final confrontation was approaching, and the fate of not just our town but possibly our entire world hung in the balance. As I walked home, I steeled myself for what was to come. The hours leading up to midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I paced my room, double-checking the backpack I had prepared. Flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, bottles of water, some energy bars, and a few personal items I thought might be useful. The amulet hung around my neck, its power now so faint I could barely feel it. As the clock struck 11:30 p.m., I slipped out of my bedroom window. The night was moonless, the streets empty and silent. Every shadow seemed to hide potential dangers, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sounds. But nothing stopped me as I made my way to the school. Miss Abernathy was already waiting in the parking lot when I arrived, her face grim in the glow of the streetlights. She wasn't alone. With her were 3 others. An elderly man I recognized as Judge Harrison, the owner of the local bookstore, Mrs. Fairfax, and to my surprise, the school's football coach, Mr. Reeves. "The last of our society," Miss Abernathy explained as I approached. "We're all that stands between our world and chaos." Judge Harrison stepped forward, his eyes examining me critically. "Are you sure about this, boy? There's no shame in backing out. What we're about to do, it's dangerous beyond anything you can imagine." I swallowed hard but stood my ground. "I'm sure I have to do this." Mrs. Fairfax smiled sadly. "Brave lad. You remind me of my grandson. He was taken 3 years ago." A somber silence fell over the group. Mr. Reeves broke it, his voice gruff. "We should get moving. The longer we wait, the stronger they become." Miss Abernathy nodded. "Right. Michael, you'll need to lead us to the door. Your connection to the creatures will allow you to see past their illusions." As we approached the school building, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The familiar brick walls now seemed menacing, hiding untold horrors behind their mundane facade. I led the group to the east wing, my steps growing heavier as we neared that fateful door. But when we turned the corner, I stopped short. The door was gone. Where it should have been was nothing but a blank wall. I blinked, disoriented. It was right here," I stammered. "It's all right," Miss Abernathy said softly. "This is their doing. They're trying to confuse us, to keep us out, but you can see through it, Michael. Focus. Remember what you saw before." I closed my eyes, concentrating on the memory of that day nearly a year ago. I could almost smell the musty air of the stairwell, feel the chill of the stone beneath my feet. When I opened my eyes again, the door was there, looking exactly as it had that fateful day. "I see it," I whispered. "Then open it," Judge Harrison urged. "Only you can." My hand trembling, I reached out and grasped the handle. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shock through my system. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open. Beyond lay the familiar stone staircase, descending into darkness. The group switched on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the gloom. As we began our descent, I could feel the malevolence in the air growing stronger with each step. We had barely reached the bottom of the stairs when we heard it, a bone-chilling screech echoing through the tunnels. The creatures knew we were here. "Quickly," Miss Abernathy urged. "We need to reach the central chamber before they can stop us." We ran through the torch-lit corridor, the sounds of pursuit growing closer behind us. As we neared the wooden door at the end, I saw that the strange symbols carved into its surface were glowing with an eerie red light. I pushed the door open, and we burst into the vast chamber beyond. It was just as I remembered, the stone pedestal in the center, the floor covered in glowing symbols. But now the air was thick with a swirling dark mist, and I could see shapes moving within it. "Form a circle around the pedestal," Mrs. Fairfax commanded. "Quickly!" We rushed to comply, joining hands around the ancient stone structure. As soon as the circle was complete, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. The symbols on the floor flared brightly, and a shimmering barrier sprang up around us. Just in time. The creatures emerged from the mist, their eyeless faces contorted with rage. They hurled themselves against the barrier but couldn't break through. "Now, Michael," Miss Abernathy said urgently. "Place the amulet on the pedestal and repeat after me." I fumbled with the chain around my neck, my hands shaking as I placed the small object on the weathered stone. As soon as it touched the surface, it began to glow with an intense light. Miss Abernathy began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, and I did my best to repeat the strange syllables. As we spoke, the light from the amulet grew brighter, spreading out to encompass the entire pedestal. The creatures' attacks on our barrier grew more frenzied, their screeches rising to a deafening pitch. I could feel the protection weakening under their assault. "Keep going," Judge Harrison encouraged. "It's working." Indeed, I could see the swirling mist being drawn towards the glowing pedestal, like water down a drain. The creatures howled in fury and fear as they too began to be pulled in. But then, just as it seemed we might succeed, disaster struck. With a final, desperate lunge, one of the creatures broke through our weakened barrier. It charged straight for me, its grotesque mouth opened wide in a silent scream. Time seemed to slow down. I saw Miss Abernathy move to intercept the creature, saw Mr. Reeves reach out to pull me back. But I knew somehow what I had to do. Instead of retreating, I stepped forward, placing my hand directly on the glowing amulet. Pain seared through me as I felt my very essence being drawn into the vortex along with the creatures in the mist. I heard the others calling my name, felt hands trying to pull me back, but I held firm. In that moment, I understood. The seal needed more than just energy. It needed a guardian, a human consciousness to maintain it from within. And I, who had seen the creatures, who had connected with their world, was the perfect candidate. As the world around me faded to white, I had one last glimpse of the chamber. The creatures were gone, sucked into the vortex along with the mist. My new friends, the last of the secret society, stared at me with a mixture of horror and awe. And then, everything disappeared. I found myself in a place beyond description, a realm of swirling energies and half-formed realities. Here I could feel the creatures, trapped and raging against their confinement. But I could also feel the strength of the seal, powered by my own life force and the ancient magics of the amulet. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this place. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of the world I left behind, my parents, my friends, the members of the society working to find a way to bring me back. But I know that my task here is vital. As long as I maintain the seal, the creatures cannot break through to our world. It's a lonely existence, but I take comfort in knowing that I've saved countless lives. The disappearances have stopped. The town is safe. And someday, perhaps, another brave soul will find a way to permanently close this gateway between worlds. Until then, I remain vigilant, the guardian of the seal, the keeper of the door that should have stayed closed. The ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest have been my home and sanctuary for as long as I can remember. I am Talon Silveroak, and for the past 2 decades, I've served as a senior ranger in the vast wilderness of the Cascade Range. The towering Douglas firs, the misty mornings, and the symphony of wildlife have been the backdrop to my life story. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for the events that unfolded last autumn. Our region has always been rife with legends. Tales of Sasquatch echoing through mountain valleys, whispers of shapeshifters lurking in shadowy groves. As a man of science, I'd always approached these stories with a healthy skepticism. That is, until I encountered something that defied all rational explanation. It was late September, and the forest was ablaze with autumn colors. I was on a routine patrol, checking on campsites and ensuring hikers were adhering to fire safety regulations. The day had been uneventful, and I was looking forward to watching the sunset from Whispering Ridge before heading back to the station. That's when the call came in. "Ranger Silver Oak, come in," crackled the voice of our dispatcher, Zira Moonglow, over the radio. There was an edge to her voice that immediately set me on alert. "Silver Oak here. What's the situation, Zira?" "We've got a distress call from a group of hikers on the Shadow Mist Trail. They're requesting immediate assistance. Sounds unusual." My pulse quickened. Shadow Mist was one of our more remote trails, known for its challenging terrain and pristine wilderness. It wasn't a place where people called for help lightly. "Any details on the nature of the emergency?" I asked, already reaching for my gear. "That's the thing, Talon," Zira replied, her voice low. "They're not making much sense. Something about a creature. They sound terrified." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. "I'm on my way. ETA 30 minutes. As I navigated the winding forest roads in my patrol vehicle, my mind raced through possibilities. Bear encounter, cougar, or something else entirely? I tried to push away the image of the creature from local legends that kept creeping into my thoughts. The sun was setting as I reached the Shadow Mist trailhead, casting long, ominous shadows across the path. I grabbed my pack, flashlight, and tranquilizer gun standard equipment for wildlife encounters, and set off down the trail at a brisk pace. About 2 miles in, I heard them before I saw them. Hushed, panicked voices carried on the evening breeze. As I rounded a bend, my flashlight beam fell on a group of 3 hikers, huddled together at the base of a massive old-growth cedar. Their eyes, wide with fear, squinted at the sudden light. "Ranger Talon Silver Oak," I called out, approaching slowly with my hands visible. "I'm here to help. Are any of you injured?" The group consisted of 2 women and a man, all in their late 20s or early 30s. They looked physically unharmed, but their faces were pale with fear, and their hands shook as they clutched their backpacks. One of the women, a tall, athletic-looking individual with intricate tattoos running down her arms, stepped forward. "I'm Arya Thornwind," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is my partner, Lyra Nightshade, and our friend, Phoenix Stormchaser." She gestured to the petite, dark-haired woman and the bearded man beside her. "We're okay, but there's something out there. Something not natural." I nodded, trying to project a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" The 3 exchanged glances, seemingly unsure where to start. Finally, Phoenix spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were setting up camp for the night when we heard something moving in the underbrush," he began. "At first we thought it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but then—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the memory. Lyra picked up the thread. "It stepped into a clearing about 50 yards from our camp. The way it moved, it was like nothing I've ever seen. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur, but it was standing on 2 legs like a man." "Its face," Arya interjected, her eyes unfocused as if seeing it all again. "It had a snout like a wolf, but the eyes... God, the eyes were almost human, intelligent, and it was watching us, studying us." A heavy silence fell over the group. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I processed their description. It matched the Dogman legends almost perfectly. "What did you do?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "We froze," Phoenix said. "We couldn't move, couldn't speak. It just stood there, staring at us. And then it howled." He shuddered at the memory. "It wasn't like a wolf, or a man, or anything I've ever heard before. It was otherworldly. After that, it disappeared back into the forest," Arya continued. "But we could hear it moving around our camp all night. Growling, sniffing. We were too terrified to sleep or to try and leave. When dawn came, it was gone, but we just ran. That's when we called for help." I nodded, processing their story. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an overreaction to a bear sighting, but their fear was too genuine, their descriptions too specific, and deep down a part of me knew this was something beyond my usual experience. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to escort you back to the trailhead. We'll get you to the ranger station where you can rest and give a full report. Then, I'm going to go back and investigate your campsite." Arya's eyes widened. "You can't go alone. That thing—" I held up a hand to stop her. "This is my job. I'm trained for this. And if there is something dangerous out there, we need to know about it to keep other hikers safe." Reluctantly, they agreed. The hike back to the trailhead was tense, with every snapping twig making the group jump. I kept my flashlight sweeping the trees, alert for any sign of movement, but we made it back without incident, and I saw them safely to their car with instructions to drive directly to the ranger station. As their taillights disappeared down the road, I turned back to face the darkening forest. The rational part of my mind told me this was foolish, that I should wait for backup or daylight. But I knew that any evidence would be long gone by morning. And if there was even a chance that the dogman was real, that it was out there right now, I had to know. I radioed in my position and intentions to Zira, ignoring her protests, and set off back down the trail. The forest at night was a different world. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the darkness. I kept my flashlight beam low, not wanting to announce my presence any more than necessary. It took me about an hour to reach the hikers' abandoned campsite. Their tent was still there, the fabric rippling gently in the night breeze. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of disturbance. That's when I saw them. The tracks. Massive canine-like prints circled the campsite, but they were deeper than any wolf or dog I'd ever encountered. And occasionally, unnervingly, the gait would shift, becoming more human-like for a few steps before returning to a four-legged pattern. It was as if the creature was constantly shifting between forms. My heart pounding, I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing. There, on a tree at about chest height, I found long, coarse hairs snagged on the bark. They were dark, almost black, and seemed to shimmer oddly in the beam of my flashlight. I carefully collected a few strands, sealing them in an evidence bag. As I straightened up, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the night. For a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light. Yellow, intelligent eyes set high off the ground. But when I blinked, they were gone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness of the forest. "This is Ranger Silver Oak. If there's anyone out there, please identify yourself." Silence was the only response, but it was a heavy silence, pregnant with possibility. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground, scanning the tree line. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, carrying notes of both animal and human vocalization. The sound raised the hair on my arms and sent a primal jolt of fear through my body. Slowly, deliberately, I began to back away towards the trail. The growl faded, but the sense of being watched remained. I walked backwards all the way to the main trail, never taking my eyes off the campsite clearing. Once I hit the trail, I turned and began to walk quickly, resisting the urge to break into a run. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming. Twice I thought I heard heavy footsteps pacing me just beyond the range of my flashlight. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead and the relative safety of my vehicle that I allowed myself to relax. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I heard it one last time, a long, mournful howl echoing through the forest. It was a sound of loneliness, of otherness, of a creature caught between two worlds. I drove back to the ranger station in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of me tried to explain it away, an unusually large wolf perhaps, or a bear walking on its hind legs. But deep down, I knew. I had encountered something that defied conventional explanation, something that blurred the line between myth and reality. Back at the station, I found Zira waiting for me, her face etched with concern. "Talon, thank goodness you're back. The hikers gave their report, but what happened out there?" I sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "Zira, I'm not sure. But I think our forests might be hiding more than we ever imagined." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the investigation. The hair samples were sent off for analysis, but as I expected, they came back inconclusive, showing genetic markers that didn't quite match any known species. The tracks were photographed and cast, but by the time a full team could investigate the site, they had already begun to deteriorate. The hiker's story made its way into the local paper, dismissed by most as a bear encounter blown out of proportion. But in the bars and cafes of the nearby towns, I heard the whispers. The legend of the Dogman was growing, fueled by this latest encounter. I couldn't let it go. Every spare moment was spent researching, digging through old reports and interviewing locals about similar sightings. Most were hesitant to talk at first, but as word spread about my encounter, people began to open up. Old Jasper Hawthorne, who'd lived in these parts for over 8 decades, told me about his grandfather's encounter with a wolf that walked like a man back in the 1920s. Maria Clearwater, a member of the local Yakima tribe, spoke of ancient legends about shapeshifters who guarded the deepest parts of the forest. The more I dug, the more I realized that these stories weren't isolated incidents. They formed a tapestry of encounters stretching back generations, all pointing to something extraordinary living in our forests. But not everyone was thrilled with my investigation. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Orion Steelheart, called me into his office about a month after the incident. "Talon, I'm concerned about the amount of time you're spending on this Dogman business," he said, his bushy eyebrows furrowed. "We have real work to do, protecting real animals and real people. I can't have you chasing fairy tales." I tried to explain, to make him understand the significance of what I'd seen, but he wouldn't hear it. "Enough," he said, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear another word about this. Focus on your actual duties, or I'll have to consider reassigning you." I left his office frustrated but undeterred. If anything, his dismissal only strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth. As autumn deepened into winter, the forests grew quiet under a blanket of snow. But my investigation continued. I spent my days off exploring the more remote areas of the park, always alert for any sign of the creature. It was on one of these expeditions, deep in the heart of the Shadow Mist Wilderness, that I made a startling discovery. Hidden in a narrow ravine, sheltered from the elements, I found a cave. And inside, scratched into the rock face, were markings unlike anything I'd ever seen. They seemed to depict figures, some human, some animal, and some a bizarre combination of the two. Among them was a recurring image, a tall, wolf-like creature standing upright. The artwork was crude but undeniably old, the edges worn smooth by the passage of time. As I stood there, flashlight in hand, staring at this ancient art, I felt a profound sense of connection to something vast and mysterious. These images were proof that whatever I'd encountered, it had been here long before us. This wasn't just some undiscovered species. It was something that had coexisted with humans for millennia, hiding in the shadows of our civilization. I carefully photographed and sketched the cave art, my mind racing with the implications. This could be the evidence I needed to prove that the Dogman was more than just a legend. But as I turned to leave the cave, I froze. There, in the fresh snow at the cave's entrance, was a single massive footprint, half wolf, half human. My blood ran cold as I realized it hadn't been here when I entered the cave. Whatever made this print had been here, watching me, only moments ago. I scanned the surrounding forest but saw nothing, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of intelligent eyes following my every move. I made my way back to my vehicle as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, as I sat in my cabin reviewing the photos I'd taken, I heard it again, that haunting, otherworldly howl echoing across the valley. But this time it sounded closer, much closer. As winter gave way to spring, reports of dogman sightings began to increase. Hikers, campers, and even a few fellow rangers came forward with stories of encounters. Each tale was similar: a massive, wolf-like creature walking on two legs, intelligent eyes, and that bone-chilling howl. The local media picked up on the story, and soon our quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest was buzzing with cryptid hunters and thrill-seekers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Dogman. This influx of people brought its own set of problems. Chief Ranger Steelheart was furious, blaming me for stirring up trouble. "This is your doing, Silver Oak," he growled during one particularly heated meeting. "Your wild goose chase has turned our park into a circus." I tried to argue that this was an opportunity. With more eyes on the forest, we had a better chance of gathering concrete evidence. But Steelheart wouldn't hear it. He assigned me to desk duty, hoping to keep me away from the investigation. But I couldn't let it go. I knew deep in my bones that we were on the verge of a discovery that could change our understanding of the natural world. So I continued my research in secret, relying on Zira and a few trusted colleagues to keep me informed about new sightings and incidents. It was Zira who brought me the news that would change everything. "Talon," Zira said, her voice low and urgent as she slipped into my office one evening. "There's been another sighting, but this one's different. A family on a camping trip. They got footage." My heart raced as Zira pulled out her tablet and played the video. It was shaky, clearly taken in a moment of panic, but what it showed was unmistakable. A large, dark figure moving through the trees on two legs. As it turned towards the camera, yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, and a distinctly canine snout became visible. "Where was this taken?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Moonfall Valley, just yesterday," Zira replied. "The family's at the station now giving their statement. But Talon, this isn't the only one. There have been 3 other sightings in the same area in the past week." I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. Moonfall Valley was deep in the heart of the forest, a place few hikers ventured. If the Dogman was becoming more active there, it could mean, "We need to get out there," I said, standing up. "Tonight," Zira nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and excitement. "I'll get the gear ready." As we prepared for our expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of something monumental. Little did I know just how right I was. We set out for Moonfall Valley as the sun was setting, the forest around us coming alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Zira and I moved silently through the underbrush, our senses on high alert for any sign of our quarry. Hours passed with no sign of the Dogman, but as midnight approached, the forest suddenly went quiet. The usual chorus of insects and nightbirds fell silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Zira and I exchanged glances, our flashlights sweeping the darkness. And then we saw it. Standing at the edge of a clearing, illuminated by the moonlight, was a creature that defied explanation. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a powerful blend of human and wolf. Dark fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands, for they were hands, not paws, ended in wicked claws. But it was the face that truly struck me. The elongated snout and pointed ears were unmistakably canine. But the eyes were almost human, filled with an intelligence and awareness that sent a shiver down my spine. For a long moment we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff. Then slowly, deliberately, the creature raised its head and let out a howl that shook me to my very core. It was a sound of loneliness, of ancient wisdom, of a being caught between worlds. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been. Zira and I stood in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what we had just witnessed. Finally, Zira spoke, her voice trembling. "Talon, what do we do now?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing with the implications of what we'd seen. "Now," I said, "we prove to the world that the Dogman is real." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. We presented our evidence, the video footage, our eyewitness account, the cave paintings, and the inconclusive DNA samples to Chief Ranger Steelheart. Though initially skeptical, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. A press conference was called, and suddenly our quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest was thrust into the global spotlight. Scientists, researchers, and media from around the world descended on our small town, all eager to catch a glimpse of the creature that was challenging our understanding of evolution and the natural world. But amidst the chaos and excitement, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. We had uncovered something ancient and mysterious, something that had successfully hidden from human eyes for centuries. Did we have the right to expose it to the world? As I grappled with these thoughts, reports began to come in of aggressive encounters with the Dogman. Campsites were ransacked, hikers were chased off trails, and livestock in nearby farms were found mutilated. The creature we had sought for so long was now a source of fear and panic. Calls for it to be captured or killed grew louder with each passing day. It all came to a head on a stormy night in late summer. Reports came in of the Dogman being cornered in a cave system near Shadow Mist Trail. A team of wildlife experts and armed rangers was being assembled to capture or neutralize the creature. I knew I had to act fast. Something deep inside me rebelled against the idea of this magnificent, mysterious being treated like a common animal. I had to find it first, to try and understand it better before it was too late. Ignoring the protests of Zira and Chief Steelheart, I set out alone into the storm-lashed forest. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the trails into muddy rivers. But I pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't fully explain. As I approached the cave system, I saw it, the Dogman, illuminated by a flash of lightning. It was injured, limping, clearly exhausted from being pursued. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a connection that transcended species. Slowly I approached, my hands open to show I meant no harm. The creature watched me warily but didn't retreat. As I got closer, I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the pain, the fear, and then something extraordinary happened. The Dogman began to change. Its form shimmered and shifted, like a mirage in the desert heat. The fur receded, the snout shortened, and the massive frame shrunk down. In a matter of moments where the Dogman had stood, there was now a man, elderly, with long silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The old man spoke, his voice rough with disuse but unmistakably human. "Talon Silveroak," he said, my name sounding strange on his lips. "You have sought me for so long. Now at last we meet." "Who? What are you?" I managed to stammer. The old man smiled, a sad, weary expression. "I am the last of my kind. We have been called many names throughout the ages: skinwalkers, shapeshifters, dogmen. We are guardians of the wild places, keepers of the balance between man and nature." He went on to explain how his people had lived in secret for millennia, watching as humanity spread across the land, pushing the wilderness back. They had the ability to shift between human and canine forms, using this power to protect the forests and its creatures. "But now," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I am the last. And I am dying. The world of man has grown too large, too loud. There is no place left for beings like me. I listened, awestruck, as he shared the history of his people, the secrets of the forest that no human had ever known. But our conversation was cut short by the sound of voices and flashlights in the distance. The capture team was closing in. "You must go," I said urgently. "They're coming for you." The old man nodded, a look of resignation on his face. "Perhaps it is time. We cannot remain hidden forever." "No," I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. "Your secret, your people's legacy, it needs to be protected. If the world knew of your existence, you'd never know peace." He looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing into my very soul. Then he nodded. "What would you have me do, Talon Silveroak?" In that moment, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I helped the shapeshifter escape, leading him through hidden trails I had discovered over my years as a ranger. We evaded the search party and made our way deep into the heart of the forest, to places where even I had never ventured. There, in a hidden valley untouched by human presence, I said goodbye to the last of the dogmen. He shared with me the secret locations of the cave paintings, the hidden caches of artifacts from his people's history, entrusting me with the preservation of their legacy. "Guard these secrets well, Talon Silveroak," he said as he prepared to disappear into the mist-shrouded forest. "For in protecting the mystery, you protect the magic of the wild places." With that, he shifted once more into his canine form and vanished into the shadows of the ancient trees. I returned to face the consequences of my actions. I told a tale of tracking the creature, only to lose it in the storm. The search was eventually called off, and the dogman became once more a legend, a mystery of the deep forests. Chief Ranger Steelheart was furious at my unauthorized solo mission, but with no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, he could do little more than issue a formal reprimand. The media frenzy eventually died down, and life in our small corner of the Pacific Northwest returned to normal. But I was changed. I carried with me the knowledge of an ancient secret, a responsibility to protect not just the tangible wilderness, but the intangible magic that dwelled within it. In the years that followed, I continued my work as a ranger with a renewed sense of purpose. I became an advocate for wilderness preservation, fighting to protect the deep, untouched places of the forest. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind whispers through the pines, I sometimes hear a distant howl, a reminder of the mysteries that still lurk in the shadows of our world. The legend of the Dogman lives on in campfire stories and local folklore, but only I know the truth, a truth I will carry with me to my grave, protecting the last of the shapeshifters and the magic of the wild places. I've always felt most at home among the ancient trees of the Appalachian Mountains. Growing up in northeast Georgia, I spent countless weekends exploring the endless maze of trails that wind through our national forests. The mountains have been my sanctuary, my escape from the mundane routines of everyday life. At least they were until that night changed everything. My love affair with hiking began in high school when my parents gave me my first real hiking boots for my 16th birthday. I started small, taking day hikes on well-marked trails, always careful to be back before sunset. As my confidence grew, so did my adventures. By college, I was doing weekend camping trips, learning to read topographical maps, and collecting gear for longer expeditions. The mountains became my second home, and I knew the popular trails like the back of my hand. That's how I met Jacob and Isaac. We crossed paths at a local outdoor gear shop where I worked part-time during college. Jacob was a geology major with an encyclopedic knowledge of rock formations, while Isaac was a wildlife photographer who could identify every bird call and animal track we encountered. We clicked immediately, bonding over shared stories of close calls with sudden storms and encounters with black bears. Every other weekend, we'd meet up for a new adventure, pushing ourselves to explore more remote and challenging trails. But there's something about the Appalachians that most tourists don't understand. These mountains have secrets. The locals whisper stories about things that shouldn't exist, about lights in the woods that can't be explained, about people who venture off the marked trails and never return. I used to laugh at these stories, used to think they were just tall tales meant to keep children from wandering too far into the forest. Now, I'm not so sure. The incident that changed everything happened during what should have been a routine camping trip. We decided to combine our love of outdoor adventure with something new: paintball. It seemed like a perfect plan at the time. The National Forest offered plenty of space, and we figured we could turn it into an overnight expedition. None of us could have predicted how that simple decision would lead us into something far darker than we could have imagined. Planning for the trip was straightforward, or at least it seemed that way at first. We chose a weekend in late October, when the leaf-peeping tourists would be thinning out, but before the real cold set in. The forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect camping weather. We packed our usual gear: a 4-season tent, sleeping bags rated for freezing temperatures, plenty of water, and enough food for 2 days. The paintball equipment was new to our loadout, but we figured it wouldn't add too much weight. I spent hours researching potential camping spots, marking coordinates on my GPS, and studying Forest Service maps. We'd camped in these woods dozens of times before, but something made me want to be extra thorough this time. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe just paranoia. Either way, I made sure to note all the access roads and potential escape routes, just in case. The morning of the trip, we met at my house before sunrise. Loading our gear into Jacob's F-150, we double-checked everything: first aid kit, emergency flares, extra batteries for our flashlights. Isaac had even brought his new satellite phone, though he admitted he hadn't tested it yet. We were prepared for any normal camping emergency. What we weren't prepared for was what actually happened. The day started normally enough. We spent hours playing paintball, ducking behind trees and crawling through underbrush. By late afternoon, we were covered in welts and paint splatters, exhausted but happy. That's when things started to go wrong. Our planned campsite, a popular spot we'd used before, was completely occupied by a church group. No problem, we thought. We'd just find another spot. As we drove deeper into the forest, the familiar trails gave way to less maintained roads. The sun was setting faster than we'd anticipated, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest seemed different in the fading light, older somehow, more primeval. The GPS signal started to fade, and our phones lost service one by one. When we came to the dirt mound blocking the road, we should have turned back. It was clearly meant to keep people out, but we were tired, slightly buzzed from the rum and cokes we'd started drinking, and the F-150 could handle it. So we crossed over, finding ourselves on an old gravel road that didn't appear on any of our maps. The campsite we found seemed perfect at first glance: a small clearing near a creek, sheltered by towering pines. But there were warning signs we chose to ignore. The scattered trash, including that ominous bottle of insecticide, the blue tarps hanging like forgotten flags from the trees, the unnatural silence: no crickets, no owls, not even the sound of wind in the leaves. The strange glow beyond the hill was what first alerted us that something was truly wrong. It wasn't moonlight. The angle was all wrong, and it had an unnatural quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat, casting weird shadows through the trees. But it wasn't just the light that felt wrong. It was the way it seemed to draw us in, like a moth to flame. "We should check it out," Jacob said, his words slightly slurred from the rum. I nodded, though every instinct screamed against it. The rational part of my brain suggested it might be other campers, maybe even someone who needed help. But if that were true, why did the light seem to hover just above the ground? And why did it pulse with that sickly greenish tinge? As we made our way up the hill, the forest around us began to change. The familiar sounds of the night woods, the rustle of small animals, the call of night birds, the whisper of wind through leaves, all fell away into an unnatural silence. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying an odd metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. Then we found the trees. At first it was just one, a massive oak with a perfect ring of missing bark at chest height, the exposed wood beneath bleached white as bone. But as we moved further up the hill, we found more. Dozens of trees, each marked in exactly the same way, forming concentric circles that seemed to spiral toward the light source. Ghost beavers, Jacob joked weakly, but his voice shook. We both knew this wasn't the work of any animal. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate, and something about the pattern nagged at my memory. Something I'd read about ritual markings used in old Appalachian folk magic. We were about 50 yards from the crest of the hill when Jacob tripped over something hidden in the leaf litter. His flashlight beam caught it as he stumbled, a pile of small animal bones arranged in a careful geometric pattern. They looked fresh, stripped clean of flesh, and bleached as white as the exposed tree rings. Just then Jacob let out a startled curse as he regained his balance. The sound seemed to shatter something in the air around us. The light didn't just go out. It collapsed in on itself with a sound like a distant muffled scream. The darkness that rushed in to fill its place felt alive, pressing against our skin like cold, wet velvet. In that moment of perfect darkness before our eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I heard something moving in the trees above us. Something big, with a sound like heavy fabric dragging over bark. Neither of us needed to discuss what to do next. We turned and ran. The journey back to camp seemed to take hours, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. The forest had changed around us, becoming maze-like and unfamiliar. Trees that I could have sworn weren't there before loomed in our path, their stripped bark glowing faintly in the moonlight. The ground beneath our feet felt wrong, too soft in some places, unnaturally hard in others, as if the earth itself was shifting. We kept getting glimpses of movement just at the edge of our vision, dark shapes that seemed to flow between the trees like liquid shadow. The air grew colder with each step, our breath coming out in visible plumes despite the relatively mild October night. Then we saw the figure by our campsite, what looked like Isaac wandering between the tent and the truck, wearing clothes we didn't recognize. Even from a distance, something about his movements was wrong. They were too fluid, too smooth, as if his joints worked in ways human joints shouldn't. He held Jacob's paintball gun with a backwards grip, examining it with motions that reminded me of a child playing with a new toy they didn't understand. As we watched, frozen in horror, the figure stopped and turned its head toward us. The movement was too quick, too sharp, like watching a video playing in reverse. Though we were still too far away to make out its face clearly, I could have sworn its neck twisted further than physically possible. What happened next has haunted my nightmares ever since. The figure, the thing that looked like Isaac, began to change. It was subtle at first, like heat waves distorting the air around it. Then its outline seemed to blur and shift, as if it couldn't quite hold on to the shape it had chosen. The real Isaac stumbled out of the tent just then, retching from too much alcohol. The other Isaac, the thing pretending to be Isaac, snapped its attention toward him. For a moment, both figures stood facing each other, like a person staring at their reflection. Then the fake Isaac began to move toward the real one, its gait becoming increasingly unnatural with each step. Its legs bent backward at the knees, its arms grew too long for its body, and its head began to split open like a flower blooming in fast motion. We broke from our paralysis and ran toward camp, shouting warnings. The creature jerked at the sound of our voices, its form rippling like disturbed water. It retreated into the shadows between the trees. but not before I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath its stolen face. Something ancient and hungry, with too many eyes and a mouth that opened sideways. The air filled with a smell like rotting leaves and copper, so strong it made my eyes water. From the darkness came a sound that I'll never forget, a perfect imitation of Isaac's laugh, but played backward and at half speed, transforming it into something that made my bones ache. Barrier raised across the road, blocking our escape. The mysterious vehicle following us with its lights off, matching our speed no matter how fast we drove. The way the moonlight seemed to bend around it, making it hard to focus on directly. It wasn't until we reached the paved road that we finally lost our pursuer. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. The nightmares started that night. Always the same. The strange light, the circling presence, the feeling of being watched by something that understood us better than we understood ourselves. Isaac developed a fear of the dark that he'd never had before. Jacob threw himself into research, spending hours reading about unexplained phenomena in the Appalachians. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something ancient and dangerous. The mountains had shown us a side of themselves that few people ever see, or at least few people live to talk about. In the months that followed, we heard other stories. A group of hikers who saw strange lights in the same area. A Forest Service ranger who quit after finding perfectly circular strips of bark removed from trees. A local hunter who swore he saw someone or something wearing his brother's face. The road we took that night? It doesn't appear on any official maps. When we tried to find it again in daylight, we couldn't. The dirt mound was there, but the road beyond it had vanished, swallowed by dense undergrowth as if it had never existed. I still hike in the Appalachians, but never alone now, and never after dark. The mountains have taught me respect, not just for the natural dangers of the wilderness, but for the things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. Sometimes on clear nights when the moon is full, I think I can see that strange glow on the horizon. It calls to something deep inside me, something primitive that remembers when humans weren't the apex predators, something that knows there are creatures out there that wear our faces and mock our certainties. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes if you're unlucky enough, they share them with you. And once you know, you can never unknow. You can never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now you understand you're not really at the top of the food chain. You're just good at pretending you are. Growing up in rural Illinois shaped my understanding of silence. Not the artificial quiet of suburbs with their distant traffic hums, but true silence, the kind that settles like a blanket over wooded acres after sunset. Our home sat at the end of a dead-end street, one of 7 houses spread across heavily wooded 2.5-acre lots. The isolation never bothered me until that summer night when I was 14, but the events that unfolded would forever change my relationship with the darkness. Our property had a particular character that set it apart from the other homes in the area. The house itself was a 2-story structure with a walkout basement, but it was the surrounding landscape that made it unique. The backyard sloped gently away from the house before disappearing into dense woodland. My parents had spent years trying to cultivate a garden in the rear of the house, but the towering oaks created such deep shade that nothing would grow. Eventually, they gave up and installed a gravel area instead, creating an unintentional security measure. Anyone walking across it would announce their presence with loud crunches unless they knew the secret. The secret was the 14-inch oak rounds my father had partially buried in the gravel, creating a makeshift path. These wooden stepping stones allowed silent passage if you knew their exact placement, which I did. Years of childhood games had taught me every inch of that yard, every shadow cast by the ancient trees, every thorny patch of wild rose and raspberry that made straying from established paths an uncomfortable prospect. I could navigate it blindfolded if needed, and often did during our more elaborate games of hide and seek. Terry lived in the house next door, though next door meant something different out there than it did in the city. Our houses were separated by about 100 yards of dense woodland, with a narrow footpath worn between them from years of back-and-forth visits. Despite being 3 years older than me, Terry had been my closest friend since we moved there when I was 6. He taught me everything I knew about moving silently through the woods, reading animal tracks, and finding the best hiding spots among the trees. We had our routines, especially during the summer months when the heat made sleep impossible and adventure seemed to lurk around every corner. Terry would often return late from outings with his friends, and instead of going straight to bed, he'd stop by my second-story window. He'd gather small stones from the gravel area and toss them against my window screen, never hard enough to make much noise, but enough that I'd hear them. We'd whisper conversations into the night air, sharing stories and secrets while the rest of the world slept. My parents were strict about curfew and generally protective, but they'd never caught on to our late-night chats. My bedroom window faced the backyard and Terry's house, positioned perfectly for our secret communications. The window itself was large, taking up almost half the wall, with a sturdy screen that kept out insects but still allowed the summer breeze to filter through. My bed sat right beneath it, making it easy to prop myself up on my elbows and talk without having to raise my voice. That summer had been particularly hot, with days bleeding into nights that never seemed to cool down. The kind of weather that made the woods feel alive, humming with insects and heavy with the scent of growing things. It was during one of these sticky nights that everything changed. I remember checking my alarm clock when I heard the car pulling into Terry's driveway. It was just past midnight. The sound of tires on gravel carried clearly through my open window, followed by the familiar cadence of Terry's voice as he said goodbye to his friends. I could tell from the engine sounds and door slams that there were at least 2 other people in the car, probably making their way home after a movie or hanging out at someone's house. Without thinking too much about it, I called out softly, hoping to catch Terry's attention for our usual late-night talk. When he didn't respond, I wasn't particularly surprised. I'd kept my voice low to avoid waking my parents, and the distance probably muffled it further. That's when I came up with what seemed like a brilliant plan at the time. I'd sneak out and startle him, just like we used to do during our childhood games. The layout of our house made sneaking out relatively easy if you knew what you were doing. The back door connected to the garage had the quietest hinges, and the steps leading down from the kitchen had one squeaky board that could be avoided by stepping close to the wall. I'd mapped every potential noise hazard during years of late-night raids on the kitchen, and navigating them had become second nature. The summer air hit me like a wall when I slipped outside, thick with humidity and carrying the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle that grew along the fence line. Moonlight filtered through the canopy of oak leaves, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow across the gravel path. I carefully picked my way across the oak rounds, moving as silently as a shadow, feeling a childish thrill of excitement at the prospect of surprising Terry. But something felt off almost immediately. I heard Terry's door close and saw his porch light switch off, indicating he'd gone inside. Yet there was movement in the woods between our houses, not along the well-worn path we always used, but through the thorny underbrush where no one typically ventured. The figure was human-sized, moving with deliberate slowness, pausing every few steps as if listening. My first thought was that Terry had spotted me and was playing along, trying to outmaneuver me in our game of stealth. I crouched among the shadows, watching the dark silhouette weave between trees, but its movements were wrong somehow. Terry knew these woods as well as I did. He would have stuck to the path, avoided the thorny bushes. This figure moved like a stranger, someone unfamiliar with the terrain, but trying desperately not to make noise. The realization that this wasn't Terry didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, like the evening shadows lengthening across our yard. The way the figure moved was all wrong, too hesitant, too careful. Terry moved through these woods with the confidence of someone who knew every root and branch. This person was clearly trying to avoid detection, but they didn't know the safe paths, the quiet ways through the undergrowth. After losing patience and growing increasingly uneasy, I whispered Terry's name, expecting, hoping, he would laugh and reveal himself. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. The figure continued its careful progression, now clearly stalking toward our house. My childhood comfort with the darkness evaporated, replaced by a creeping dread that made my skin prickle. I retreated to the house with a caution that went beyond my usual stealth, my heart thundering so loudly in my chest that I feared it might give me away. Each step felt like an eternity as I carefully retraced my path across the oak rounds. The garage door handle, usually so familiar, felt foreign in my trembling hands. I locked it behind me with exquisite care, terrified that even the click of the mechanism might somehow reveal my presence. The journey back upstairs was a masterclass in silent movement. I avoided the squeaky step without thinking, my muscle memory taking over despite my rising panic. Back in my room, I could still hear movement below, careful footsteps in the gravel, punctuated by the occasional snap of twigs. Then came the sound that still haunts my dreams, a loud grunt and moan from directly below my window, followed by the distinct sound of someone falling into the window well. The window well was a semicircular pit extending about 4 feet deep, allowing light into the basement windows. Every kid in the neighborhood knew where they were. Falling into one wasn't just unlikely, it was practically impossible for anyone familiar with the property. The sound of something pulling itself out was almost worse than the fall. Too controlled, too quiet for someone who had just taken an unexpected tumble. I pressed my face against the window screen, straining to see into the darkness below. The crunch of gravel revealed the intruder's continued presence, each step a violation of our carefully maintained silence. Terry would never make such noise. He knew where every log round was placed, understood the importance of stealth around my strict parents. The minutes crawled by like hours as I sat frozen by my window, barely breathing, listening to the occasional sounds of movement below. The figure never called out, never revealed itself. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of shadowy figures watching from the woods. The next morning, I woke to bright sunshine streaming through my window, making the events of the night seem almost like a bad dream. But the memory was too vivid, too detailed to dismiss. I went downstairs early, before my parents were awake, and examined the area around the window well. The gravel was disturbed in places where it shouldn't have been, and there were clear signs that someone had indeed fallen into and climbed out of the window well. When I saw Terry later that day, I tried to keep my voice casual as I asked him about the previous night. His confused expression confirmed what I already knew. He'd gone straight to bed after being dropped off. But as I described what I'd seen and heard, his face grew serious. "There's something I should probably tell you," he said, leading me to the old tree stump where we often sat to talk. "I didn't want to worry you before, but about a week ago I noticed some weird things happening around here." He went on to describe finding unfamiliar footprints in the soft earth near his house, cigarette butts in places where no one in his family smoked, and once, late at night, seeing a flashlight beam moving through the woods where no light should have been. He'd written it off as paranoia, or maybe local teenagers looking for a place to hang out. But my story changed his perspective. The following weeks took on a different character. We began paying more attention to the subtle signs we'd previously ignored: broken branches on rarely used paths, displaced rocks, the occasional sound of movement in the woods at odd hours. Our parents noticed our changing behavior but attributed it to normal teenage moodiness. One afternoon, while helping my father clean the gutters, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a cluster of leaves was a crude platform made of branches, wedged between two sturdy limbs of an oak tree near my window. It wasn't anything Terry and I had built during our childhood games. This was new, purposefully concealed, and positioned with a clear view into my room. That discovery led to a series of changes around our property. My father installed motion sensor lights and trimmed back the tree branches near the house. He didn't know about the platform. I never told him, fearing it would lead to restrictions on my freedom that would make my teenage years unbearable. But I did insist on getting curtains for my window, something I'd never wanted before. Terry and I developed new routines. Our late-night conversations moved to phone calls instead of window visits. We started documenting anything unusual we noticed, creating a shared journal of suspicious activities. Most entries probably had innocent explanations, but some, like the day we found a half-eaten sandwich and empty water bottle hidden in a hollow tree, suggested someone was spending significant time in our woods. The local police weren't much help when we finally decided to report our concerns. Without concrete evidence of a crime, they could only promise to increase patrols in the area. But we noticed that cars started driving down our dead-end street more frequently, their slow pace and official markings suggesting police presence. As summer faded into fall, the incidents gradually decreased. Maybe the increased police presence scared off whoever had been watching, or maybe they simply lost interest and moved on. But the experience had permanently altered how I viewed our isolated home. The woods that had once been my playground became something different, still beautiful, still familiar, but now holding the possibility of watching eyes, of figures moving in shadow, of strangers who might stand in the darkness below open windows. The incident affected Terry and me in different ways. He became more protective, installing security cameras around his property as soon as he could afford them. I developed a heightened awareness of my surroundings that persists to this day, an almost primal sensitivity to the subtle signs that something isn't quite right. Years later, during a college psychology course, I learned about the concept of environmental awareness, how humans are naturally attuned to subtle changes in their familiar surroundings. The professor explained that this awareness often manifests as an unexplained sense of unease before we consciously recognize what's wrong. I thought back to that night, wondering if some part of me had sensed the intruder's presence even before I saw them, if that's what had really prompted me to go outside. The woods behind our houses still stand, the oak trees now taller, the paths we once used mostly grown over. I visit my parents occasionally, and sometimes late at night, I find myself drawn to my old bedroom window. The view has changed. The motion lights and security cameras create pools of artificial brightness where darkness once reigned. But beyond their reach, in the depths of the woods, shadows still move in ways that make me wonder. Terry still lives next door, having taken over his parents' house. We talk about that summer sometimes, comparing notes and memories, trying to make sense of what really happened. We never learned who was watching us or why they chose our woods. In some ways, the not knowing is worse than any explanation could be. That perfect silence I grew up with, the one I used to find so comforting, now carries a different weight. Because I learned that summer night that true silence isn't empty. It's waiting to be broken by the crunch of gravel under unknown feet, by the grunt of a stranger in the dark, by the sound of someone who shouldn't be there, moving through spaces they don't belong. The experience taught me something fundamental about fear, not the quick adrenaline-fueled fear of sudden threats, but the slow, creeping kind that comes from realizing the spaces you thought were safe might harbor unknown dangers. It's the kind of fear that changes you permanently, that makes you look twice at shadows and question the sounds you hear in the night. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I still find myself listening for footsteps in the gravel, for the sound of someone trying too hard to move silently through familiar spaces. The rational part of my mind knows that whoever was there that night is long gone, but another part, the part that remembers the sound of someone falling into the window well, remains alert, watching, waiting. Because in the end, The most terrifying realization wasn't that someone had been watching us that summer. It was understanding that they might have been watching for much longer than we knew, learning our patterns, studying our movements, becoming familiar with our world while remaining just outside its edges. And sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if they're out there somewhere, watching other houses, other windows, other unsuspecting people who think they're alone in the dark. The countryside at night was our kingdom. At 17, Terry and I had mapped every back road, every hidden path within 20 miles of our rural Illinois homes. We'd discovered them all on our longboards, spending countless summer nights gliding through darkness where the only sounds were our wheels on pavement and the whisper of wind through trees. Living in an area where houses sat on multi-acre lots separated by dense woodland had its advantages. Traffic was nearly non-existent after sunset, and any approaching vehicles announced themselves long before they appeared, headlights painting the trees and engine sounds carrying clearly through the still night air. This isolation made our nocturnal adventures feel safe, controlled, until the night everything changed. It was mid-August, and the air hung heavy with the promise of rain. We'd been watching the weather obsessively, knowing our favorite route would soon be impassable. The centerpiece of our nightly runs was a narrow causeway that cut across Marshall Lake, connecting two sections of the local nature preserve. After heavy rains, the causeway would disappear underwater for weeks at a time. "Last chance before it floods," Terry had said when he showed up at my door around 11. The moon was nearly full, bright enough that we barely needed our headlamps. Perfect conditions for one final run. The first part of our journey was routine, gliding down empty roads past scattered farmhouses, their windows dark and silent. We kept a steady pace, knowing the real treat lay ahead. When we reached the causeway entrance, we paused to take in the view. Marshall Lake stretched out on both sides, its surface like polished obsidian under the moonlight. During daylight hours, the lake drew fishermen and families, but at night it transformed into something else, something wild and pristine. The causeway itself was a 2-mile stretch of paved path, just wide enough for maintenance vehicles, with low guardrails on either side. Terry positioned his board at the entrance, grinning. "Race you to the far side?" That's when I saw it, a faint light at the opposite end of the causeway, where the path disappeared into the preserve. At first I thought it might be a reflection from the water, or maybe a late-night fisherman's lantern. But the movement was wrong. The light seemed to pulse and split, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. "You see that?" I whispered, though there was no one around to hear. Terry nodded slowly. "What the hell is it?" As we watched, the light began to change. It multiplied, splitting into smaller points that danced and weaved like fireflies, but far too bright, far too deliberate in their movements. A low hum started to build, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder. Then everything happened at once. The night exploded with light and sound, multiple engines roaring to life simultaneously, their noise amplified by the water on either side. Headlights blazed from both ends of the causeway and from the wooded shores, creating a web of light that caught us in its center. We abandoned our boards without discussion. The woods to our right offered the best chance of cover, but reaching them meant crossing 30 feet of exposed ground. Before we could move, the first vehicle appeared, a massive ATV with modified headlights that turned night into day. Its rider was a hulking figure in dark clothing, and something metallic glinted in his hand. Two motorcycles screamed out of the tree line ahead, cutting off our planned escape route. Their riders were similarly dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by full-face helmets with reflective visors. "There!" The shout came from behind us. "Don't let them reach the woods!" Terry grabbed my arm, yanking me toward a maintenance access road we'd discovered during previous explorations. It was overgrown and steep, but it led to a network of drainage ditches we knew well. We sprinted uphill on loose gravel, our legs burning with effort. The fourth rider appeared at the top of the access road, his ATV's engine growling as he started down toward us. We were caught between them, with the lake on one side and dense undergrowth on the other. "The washout," Terry gasped. "Remember?" I did. Last spring's floods had collapsed a section of hillside, exposing old drainage pipes that connected to the lake's water management system. We'd explored them once, during daylight hours, finding they linked to a larger network of tunnels and chambers. We crashed through the undergrowth, thorns tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, engines revved and voices shouted. A spotlight swept over our heads as we half ran, half fell down the eroded slope. The washout was a dark gash in the hillside, partially hidden by fallen trees. We scrambled down into it just as headlights illuminated the area we'd just left. Voices carried clearly in the night air. They had to have seen the delivery. The whole operation's compromised. "Find them. Use whatever force necessary. We can't risk witnesses." We crawled deeper into the washout, the space narrowing until we had to move on hands and knees. The ground was wet and sticky with mud, making each movement a struggle. Above us, footsteps crunched on loose stone as our pursuers searched on foot. A beam of light penetrated the darkness, scanning the washout's entrance. We pressed ourselves flat against the mud, barely breathing. The beam passed over us once, twice, then moved on. "Check the drainage system," someone called. "They might try to use the runoff pipes." That was exactly our plan, but we were already committed. The washout opened into a concrete pipe large enough to crawl through. In daylight, we'd seen it ran about 50 yards before connecting to a larger drainage system. Now, in complete darkness, that distance seemed infinite. We began moving through the pipe, trying to stay quiet despite the way every sound echoed. Water dripped somewhere ahead, and the air grew thick with the smell of rust and decay. A metallic clang rang out behind us. They were using something to probe the pipe. Each strike sent vibrations through the concrete, making my teeth rattle. They were methodically working their way toward us. "I think I heard something." The voice was distorted by the pipe's acoustics. "Pass me the light." Terry grabbed my ankle and pulled me into a smaller side pipe, a connection we'd discovered but never dared explore. It was barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, and it angled sharply downward. We had no choice. As bright light flooded the main pipe behind us, we started sliding down the side channel. The angle grew steeper, and suddenly we were falling more than crawling, unable to slow our descent in the slick concrete tube. The pipe ended abruptly, dropping us about 3 feet into standing water. We were in a larger junction chamber, with multiple pipes feeding into it from different directions. The water was knee-deep and numbingly cold. Voices echoed down the pipe we'd just escaped, along with the scrape of metal on concrete. They were still coming. Terry pointed to another pipe across the chamber, this one larger and partially obscured by flowing water. We waded across as quietly as possible, each splash sounding thunderous in the enclosed space. Just as we reached the new pipe, light appeared in the one we'd fallen from. We pressed ourselves against the chamber's wall, hidden behind a concrete support pillar. 2 beams of light swept the chamber. Water splashed as someone dropped down into it. "Footprints in the sediment," a voice said. "They're here somewhere. Flush them out. Use the gas." A new sound filled the chamber, the hiss of pressurized gas being released. Within seconds, an acrid smell reached us, making our eyes water and throats burn. We dropped into the large pipe, not caring about noise anymore. This one was different, older, with breaks in the concrete that let in roots and soil. The water running through it was deeper, almost reaching our faces as we crawled. "They're in the main runoff pipe," the voice echoed behind us. "Radio the others. They'll come out by the river if they make it through." The water got deeper as we moved, the pipe seeming endless. The gas followed us, making each breath a struggle. Then Terry stopped suddenly. "The water's pulling harder," he whispered. "There's a drop ahead." The sound of rushing water grew louder. Terry felt ahead with his foot. "It drops into the river. We have to chance it." Light flooded the pipe behind us and the gas was getting thicker. We grabbed each other's hands and pushed forward. The pipe's bottom disappeared, and we were falling, sliding through rushing water. The roar became deafening. We burst out of the pipe into open air, falling about 10 feet into the river below. The impact drove the breath from our lungs. The current immediately caught us, sweeping us downstream. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness above, searching the water's surface. We fought to keep our heads above water while staying quiet. The river bent sharply ahead, and as we rounded the curve, we saw more lights waiting. They had people positioned along the banks. Terry pointed toward the far side, where overhanging trees created deep shadows. We swam diagonally across the current, staying as low in the water as possible. A spotlight swept over us just as we reached the shadows, and we pressed ourselves against the muddy bank under exposed tree roots. Vehicles raced along both riverbanks, their lights probing the water. Boats with searchlights began patrolling the river. "They couldn't have survived that current," someone shouted. "Not in the dark. Find the bodies. We need to be sure." We stayed hidden in the roots for hours, watching the search continue. Only when the first light of dawn appeared did we realize where we were, less than a mile from the old Miller farm. Its abandoned caretaker's cottage still had a working landline phone. We dragged ourselves out of the river and made our way to the cottage, every muscle screaming in protest. Terry found a loose window, and we crawled inside. The phone worked, one of those old models that doesn't need electricity. Terry called his older brother, speaking in whispers, giving directions. We hid in the cottage's root cellar until we heard his brother's truck, waiting for their special whistle signal before emerging. The ride home was tense, taking back roads and constantly checking for followers. The next day, officials found our abandoned longboards by the causeway. We told our parents we'd gotten spooked by locals and ran. A week later, the local paper ran a small article about a drug bust in the preserve, but the details were vague. The drainage pipe was sealed up a month later, officially due to structural concerns. The causeway was gated off, with no access allowed after sunset. Sometimes, driving past the lake during daylight, I'd see unmarked vehicles with dark windows parked at the far end. They always pulled away if anyone slowed down to look. Terry moved away the following year, but before leaving he told me something. He'd gone back to the causeway alone, in daylight, just to look. Where we'd first seen the strange lights, he found marks in the mud by the water's edge. Not tire tracks or footprints, but something else entirely. He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. These days the lake is popular during daylight hours, but locals clear out well before sunset. An unspoken understanding passed down through years. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is bright, you can still see lights at the far end of the causeway, lights that move in ways they shouldn't. But no one investigates anymore. The preserve holds its secrets, and the darkness holds its territory. And those of us who have encountered what waits in that darkness know better than to venture back. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries. Some places are meant to stay unexplored, and some nights are better spent safely at home, away from dark waters and the things that patrol them. As for me, I still hear the echoes of that night in my dreams. The roar of engines, the scrape of metal on concrete, the hiss of gas in the tunnels. But most of all, I remember those strange lights at the end of the causeway, splitting and dancing in ways that defy explanation. Whatever we almost witnessed that night remains unknown, and I've learned to be grateful for that ignorance, because sometimes not knowing is the only thing that keeps you alive. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, I found myself asking for a divorce. It's a strange story, but a true one, and I'll tell you all the details. I was a bride in a state far from my hometown, and on my wedding day, my husband's family came to take me to the marital home. The journey was long and exhausting, taking a full 4 hours on the road. We arrived near the time of the ASR prayer, and fatigue had taken its toll on me, but I was trying to hide it behind the happy bride's smile. I entered the house amid the women's ululations and the cheers of those present. The house was crowded with guests and relatives who had come to celebrate the arrival of the new bride. I started preparing myself mentally for the moment when I would sit at the forefront of the gathering, as is customary for the bride on her wedding night. I imagined myself sitting in my beautiful white dress, surrounded by congratulating women, my heart pounding with both happiness and nervousness. But what happened next turned all my expectations upside down. My mother-in-law approached me, a woman of dignity and poise, and said to me in a firm voice, "Before you sit at the forefront, you must enter the kitchen." I looked at her in astonishment, as did my mother who was standing beside me. My mother asked in surprise, "What will she do in the kitchen? She's a bride who has just arrived from a long journey." My mother-in-law replied in a tone that brooked no argument, "It is our tradition here that when a bride enters her husband's house for the first time, she must knead and bake 10 loaves of bread. When she finishes and the household eats from them and approves, only then can she begin to sit at the forefront of the gathering." For a moment, I thought she was joking. I laughed lightly and said, "Surely you must be joking, Aunt. I'm a bride and I've just arrived after a long and tiring journey. How can I knead and bake 10 loaves in this state?" But my mother-in-law's serious look told me she wasn't joking at all. She confirmed to me, saying, "These are our customs and traditions, and you must respect and implement them." I felt shock and anger overwhelm me. I looked at my mother with pleading eyes, and she in turn tried to mediate and convince my mother-in-law to abandon this request, but to no avail. At that moment, I felt as if the world was spinning around me. How could this happen on my wedding day? How could they ask me to do such hard work when I was in full bridal attire and exhausted? In my desperation, I called my husband asking for his intervention. I was hoping he would stand by me and refuse this strange request. But his response shocked me even more as he said, "Listen to my mother and do as she says. There's no need to cause problems on the first day." I stood there, bewildered, feeling insulted and angry. It wasn't the kneading itself that bothered me, as I was used to helping with housework in my parents' home. But what really hurt me was the way it was done, and its timing on a day that was supposed to be the most beautiful in my life. I tried to negotiate, saying, "Aunt, can we postpone this until tomorrow morning? If you wish, I'll prepare the entire lunch by myself tomorrow." But my mother-in-law was insistent, and said firmly, "If you don't knead and bake now, your wedding won't be complete." At that moment, I felt my dignity had been trampled. I imagined myself, with my perfect hairstyle and beautiful makeup, standing in front of the dough in the kitchen instead of being the center of attention among the well-wishers at the forefront of the gathering. It was more than I could bear. With tears of anger and frustration, I shouted, "Enough! Gather my things and call my father. I want to go back to our house now." Everyone looked at me in shock, but I was determined. At that moment, I decided that I couldn't continue in a marriage that started this way. I asked for a divorce, fully aware of the gravity of my decision, but I felt it was the right one. Now, after time has passed, I sometimes find myself wondering, was my decision hasty? Was the reason trivial, as some say? But I soon remember my feeling of humiliation and degradation at that moment, and I realized that the matter was bigger than just kneading bread. It was about respecting my feelings and dignity as a human being, and my right to be treated with respect, especially on my wedding day. It's true that many people blame me, saying, "If you had just done what your mother-in-law asked, everything would have been fine." But I wonder, would everything really have been fine? Or was this incident just the beginning of a series of concessions I would have had to make at the expense of my self-respect? In the end, I realized that marriage should be built on mutual respect and understanding, not on blind submission to traditions that can sometimes be unfair. Despite the difficulty of the decision, I feel that I chose to respect myself, and it's a choice I will never regret. And to you who hear my story, do you think my decision was right or was I mistaken?